I'm pleased to be here because anytime I can be in a room with a group of folks who care about and promote arts, in particular arts education, that's somewhere I want to be. And there are a couple of things that I want to do with my remarks this morning. The first is I hope that I can inspire you. I know you all work hard, you believe in what you do, you've been fighting some really tough battles for many years. So one of my jobs is to provide you with some extra juice to keep you going once you go back home next week. I also want to provide you with some specific things you can try in your own communities across the country, things you might not have tried before, things you might not have even thought of. And lastly, I want to be provocative, push the envelope a little bit. I can tell you right off the bat that no matter what Heather said in her introduction, I don't have all the answers. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of seeing former President Bill Clinton speak. And after responding to the moderator's questions with typical Clintonian 10 to 15-minute answers, he responded to one question with a simple, "I don't know." And after the shock of that answer had sort of subsided a bit, he said, "I try to say I don't know at least once an hour." I think that's a good lesson in humility from someone who's not necessarily known for that particular attribute. That wasn't a bad Clinton impersonation, was it? I think my cold is helping that. So I don't have all the answers. You might agree or disagree with me on any number of things. That's okay, that's great. It's not our job this morning to come to consensus. I just want to give you some things to think about. In talking with you all today, I'm really happy to be in a position to share some recent research with you. The company that I work for, Metropolitan Group, as Heather mentioned, is part of a national planning team to develop a public will building strategy for the arts as a recognized, valued, and expected part of everyday life. The project is being led by Arts Midwest with lead funding from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. We've been working on pilots in 4 locations: Michigan, Minnesota, Oregon, and California. As Heather mentioned, in San Jose, being led by Carrie Adams Hapner, the Director of Cultural Affairs for the City of San Jose. Any San Jose folks here? There must be. Excellent. In partnership with Craig Watson and the California Arts Council. We've just completed a national survey with oversampling in our 4 pilot states about public attitudes and understanding about the arts and culture, trying to fill in some gaps in previous research on the subject. And we're about to go into focus groups testing in early December to explore some of the stuff even further. We're going to release our findings and recommendations early next year, so we're obviously not yet done for the research, but there's some stuff I want to share with you this morning. What I'm going to share with you is what we've learned so far, both to whet your appetite for what's to come early next year and to provide you with some tangible things to start thinking about in your communities. As I mentioned, our purpose ultimately is to develop and implement a plan to build public will for the arts and culture as a recognized, valued, and expected part of everyday life. Because right now, that public will just doesn't exist. You just don't see many signs like this out there. As my partner and colleague Eric Friedenwald Fishman is fond of saying, for most people, the arts are a nicety rather than a necessity. That doesn't mean that people don't care about the arts and arts education. They do. Research has shown that, and our research has confirmed it. It's just not the top priority for most people. Oh, it's on the list, but it tends to be pretty far down the list of things people value in their lives and their communities. At the top of the list are things like family and well-being, faith and spirituality, that kind of thing. Now, that's not terribly surprising when you think of the hierarchy of needs for folks in their own lives and communities. It's no surprise they care about their families, their kids, safety, jobs, good schools, health and well-being. Our task is not to unseat any of those things in people's minds, but to connect the arts and culture to the things they care about. That's the trick. We don't need them to care less about their families or about their health and well-being. We just need them to understand how arts and culture connect to those things. That understanding will come about, however, by giving people more data, more facts. People already believe that exposure to arts and culture in their lives is good for them. Good for their health and well-being, good for reducing their stress, helping them to connect with other people, learn something new. They also believe that it's really good for their kids. It provides them with a well-rounded education and better prepares them for college and career. All the data we put out there about the impact of the arts on our lives, our education, our communities, our economy, people get it. And as a result of believing this, people are generally in support of the arts, particularly when it comes to arts education for all kids. And one of the takeaways from our national survey is that Americans overwhelmingly believe that opportunities to experience arts and culture should be affordable by everyone. So, if the facts are already on our side, and the majority of people already understand and agree with us, then why are we having such a hard time? Part of the reason is that there's a big difference between public opinion and public will. People have opinions on all sorts of things, and it's really not all that tough to get people to believe something, at least for a little while. What we need is not public opinion, but public will. The kind of public will that translates beliefs and attitudes into behaviors, policies, and cultural norms. About 10 years ago, we published our framework for building public will, which has 5 phases. We don't have time to go through all 5 of them today, so I'm going to focus on the first one, which is framing the problem. Because in our experience, that's where a lot of social purpose advocates make their first and most fundamental mistake. Because if you're not starting with an effective frame, then nothing else is going to work for you. Framing theory tells us that when we're presented with new information, what we believe and the choices we make or don't make are directly connected to our core values and to our views and assumptions about how the world works. Framing theory draws on extensive research about how our brains function and process information, and there are really 6 fundamental ideas behind it. First, that we use mental shortcuts to make sense of the world around us and process the vast amount of information that we're bombarded with every day. Researchers I've worked with have called us frugal cognators, which is a great way of saying we're intellectually lazy. We look and listen for clues in that information to help us decide whether we should pay attention to that information or not. Those clues connect the information to certain stories or narratives we already have in our heads. The Cinderella story, the local kid made good story, the prodigal son story, the hooker with a heart of gold story. Narratives, too, that are dominant in our culture. The undeserving poor, supported by hard-working, tax-paying middle class. The illegal aliens taking our jobs. The nanny state telling us how to raise our kids. Those narratives. These stories trigger values that we hold deeply and which we share across generations and cultures. Values like freedom, privacy, my home is my castle, community, family, fairness. And these values and the stories associated with them help us assign responsibility for resolving the problem. We become really adept at determining very quickly whose fault it is to fix it, and it's most of the time not us. And finally, all of this works together to suggest to us that certain solutions are relevant and some aren't. What's interesting about the power of frames is that information that contradicts our frame, no matter how solid the data might be, is disregarded. In other words, values trump facts. Facts really work best in reinforcing a belief, choice, or decision that we've already made, reinforcing the purchase decision, if you will. But facts and information seldom, and I mean seldom, change anyone's mind about anything unless their mind wasn't really all that made up to begin with. I mean, look at the ongoing debate about climate change. The facts just don't seem to change some people's minds. So here's a little test for you. Suppose I show you this picture and tell you that the man in the White House has developed a rare form of cancer. He's never smoked, doesn't drink, but he's developed cancer and no one knows why. Why is this man sick? Whose fault is that? Whose job is it to fix that? Now let me alter the picture a little bit and ask you the same questions. Why is this man sick? Whose fault is that? Whose job is it to do something about that? I suspect your answers to the second set of questions is very different than the first. All right? That's what framing is all about. Here's an example of this in the real world. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, these 2 pictures crossed the wires. The left one describes these white residents as wading through water to get supplies, and on the right, the African-American male is described as a looter. And these evoke very different kinds of frames. On the left, triggering the values of community, and the problem is innocent people experiencing tragic circumstances and beyond their control, and the solution is to send money, send food. the picture and the frame on the right suggesting values of authority and justice. The problem is that bad people are taking advantage of a bad situation and making it worse, and the solution is to send in the National Guard. Photos here and the words use very different realities. Let's apply framing theory to another issue that we've worked on at Metropolitan Group that I think has direct relevance to your work, historic preservation. A couple of years ago, we were hired by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. After 50 years, the historic preservation movement and the organization itself have gotten older. Its core constituency is literally dying off. And while that might be good news for fundraisers trying to build a planned giving program, it's not much good for anybody else in the preservation movement. So we were hired to develop a new brand platform and message framework to help engage a broader and younger audience. Basically, they were looking for folks we called latent preservationists. People who buy and fix up old houses. They shop at local mom and pop stores instead of big box stores. They take their kids to historic sites on vacation. They'll watch a documentary on television if the subject interests them. But they would never describe themselves as preservationists. We did a lot of research on these folks, including 12 focus groups in 4 communities across the country, including San Francisco. And we found that this audience had a very unhelpful frame on historic preservation that looked something like this. I'm glad you like that. Historic home of a dead rich white guy. They just didn't see any relevance to historic preservation in their own lives. To them, preservation is about Mount Vernon and Monticello. It's not about places they care about. The diner where they ate with their parents as kids, the church where their grandparents were married, the old house on the corner they always thought was haunted on Halloween. To them, historic preservation was determined by other people who were deciding what is and what is not worth preserving, and it turned them off. The good news is that we found we could engage them pretty effectively by reframing and redefining historic preservation as being about the protection, enhancement, and enjoyment of places that matter to people. Suddenly, the target audience was a lot more interested. It connected with their core values, and they saw the relevance to that in their own lives. And the reframing to this place matters totally reinvigorated the historic preservation movement across the country. Suddenly, people were printing out this place matters on their home printers and taking and posting pictures on Flickr about the places that mattered to them. I think the lesson from this experience is really relevant here. Another issue that ordinary people sometimes find hard to connect to their own lives, where there's an assumption about some things being important and worthy and other things not, where it's associated with East Coast or at least urban elites. So framing matters, and before we can change the frame on arts and arts education, we have to understand the current frame and how it helps us and how it hurts us. And for that, I'd like to start with a book by George Lakoff called Moral Politics. I highly recommend it to you if you haven't already read it. In the book, Lakoff writes that the country is not divided between red states and blue states, or even between liberals and conservatives, but between those with a strict father mentality and those with a nurturant parent mentality. I think you can guess what those two things mean. And in the book, Lakoff writes about their very different perspective on a whole host of issues, including arts and education. First, let's look at education. According to Lakoff, strict fathers look on education from the perspectives of authority and discipline, standards and accountability. Education should teach kids the basics and prepare them to be productive and successful in the world. Nurturant parents, on the other hand, look on the self-actualizing aspect of education, the search for truth, asking tough questions. Yes, there are standards and accountability, but we're accountable and responsible to each other, and standards help ensure that. And part of the job of education is to help children develop their creativity and their imaginations and embrace diversity. What about the arts? According to Lakoff, those with a strict father mentality think art should serve a higher moral purpose. It should be something beautiful to be appreciated and admired. It should be a source of pleasure or entertainment. It should uplift and inspire us, and it should be a solid economic investment. What about nurturant parents? Well, something interesting happens here because the pretty straightforward dichotomy we saw in education is missing here. Turns out that nurturant parents share a lot of these same perspectives as strict fathers. They might not require them of the arts like strict fathers do, but they expect the arts to fulfill them. At the same time, nurture and parents also think art should help us search for truth and ask tough questions. It should increase our understanding and empathy. It can be healing. The overlap here is interesting. It explains why you don't find many people beyond the quote-unquote arts community who are willing to stand up and defend the arts when something controversial sparks public outrage. Lakoff suggests that's because a lot of so-called liberals really don't understand art very well and respect it for pushing boundaries and buttons. Most of them would really rather be looking at Monet than Mapplethorpe. So in considering all of this, I think there are some obvious implications in promoting lifelong arts learning. It should be relatively easy to engage and motivate, nurture, and parents because they're likely to believe that the arts should be integrated into our educational experiences because they improve overall achievement. And as a standalone, they enlighten and enrich our kids. But strict fathers are more likely to see the arts as okay if it helps students to achieve more in the basics of their education. As a standalone part of the curriculum, it better serves some higher moral purpose. And even then, it's a nicety rather than a necessity. But you know what? Here's the good news. We don't have to win over every strict father. You don't need everyone on board to effectively build public will, to change cultural norms, and to make policy change happen. Anti-smoking behaviors, policies, laws, cultural norms all came about in spite of the fact that a sizable minority of Americans continues to smoke and millions of dollars continues to be spent to market those products. You don't need to convince everybody. You just need to convince enough people to tip the balance in your favor. Today, every politician knows that elections are determined by so-called undecided voters. That's what I'm suggesting we try to do in building public will for the arts and culture as a recognized, valued, and expected part of everyday life. Except that there is already a core group of folks on our side, so-called arts enthusiasts, people who already get it. We need to energize this group and get them riled up, and we certainly don't want to piss them off. We know what this group tends to look like. The data is pretty clear. They're liberal or independence-leaning liberal. They're teachers or well-educated college grads. They're professionals, and they're considered to be active in the arts. They make more than $75,000 a year, and many of them are white. And our research suggests it's about 1/3 of the population who say that opportunities to experience arts and culture in their everyday lives is very important. And on the flip side, we need to accept that there is also a core group of folks, our research suggests it's about 11% of the country, that don't get it and don't want to. They just don't see being artistic or creative or expressing their culture as important at all in their lives. They live in more rural areas. They're more conservative politically, socially, and spiritually. More of them are men, and more of them are white. They're not going to buy what we're selling at any price. So you know what? We need to stop trying. Instead, we need to focus our attention on some of the folks in the middle, the folks who see value in being artistic or creative or expressing their culture, but they wouldn't necessarily describe it or label it that way. In fact, they would probably say they're not terribly artistic or creative people, although they're doing things every day that fit that description. They're taking pictures with their smartphones, playing around with filters and posting them. They're mixing their own music on their laptops and posting videos on YouTube. They're making jewelry at home and selling it to their friends. They're taking pride in their gardens or their cooking. They're making stuff out of found objects or going to cultural festivals. They're salsa dancing at block parties or finally taking up the piano. But they would never call themselves artists. They just know what they're doing makes a difference in their lives. It helps them express themselves as individuals and share their unique voice. It helps them connect with who they are and where they come from. It gives them a chance to do something with their kids. It helps them relax and reduces their stress. In short, what they're doing directly connects back to the things our surveys show they care most about: their children and their family, their health and their well-being. And what do these folks look like? Well, for one thing, they tend to be much more diverse. Many more people of color than the groups at either end of the spectrum. They tend to be younger. They've got kids under 18. They like doing things as a family. They would consider themselves spiritual, but not necessarily religious. They're actively engaged in their communities, and more of them are women. The trick for us is to find a way to engage this diverse audience in a way that helps them more overtly and consciously connect what they're already doing and what they already care about, and showing them that these creative ways of expressing or enjoying themselves are actually part of something bigger that's important in all of our lives. something that connects them to their communities, to the local community theater, to the art program in their kids' school, to the little art gallery on the corner, or the cultural festivals held each summer, to the art museum downtown, something that should be valued and protected and supported. Now that we know what this audience is doing and how it connects to what they care about, we have to figure out how to reach them with a message that's going to motivate them. That's what we're going to be testing in our focus groups in December. So let me tell you what we're thinking about right now. First, we need to recognize that there's a difference between arts and culture, and it might not be the best way to describe what people are doing and valuing in their own lives. For one thing, our research tells us people define them very, very differently. Arts are something you create, a painting, a photograph, a sculpture. Culture is something more amorphous. It's something you do, part of your lifestyle, connected to your heritage perhaps. When they hear the word arts, most people tend to think of arts in the terms of a capital A, so-called fine arts, institutional art, represented by theater and dance companies, art museums, and galleries. And while there is definitely a segment of our society for whom engagement with this kind of capital A art is very important, it just doesn't register as important to most people. There's one exception to this that is directly relevant to this audience. When it comes to an explicit conversation about arts and culture, people are all for it in terms of education of their children. It's the one place where explicitly talking about arts and culture actually works for people, and I'll come back to that in a few moments. But arts and culture generally resonates less powerfully with adults in the context of their own lives. It's just not something they rank very highly. What does resonate with people more highly and is more motivating to them is when we frame what they're doing and valuing in their own lives in terms of self-expression. In fact, when we ask people whether it's important for them to be creative, artistic, or to have opportunities to express their culture in their lives, 63% said yes, which was impressive in and of itself. 34% of folks said it was very important, and 1/3 of people, 36%, said it just wasn't important. In a split sample, we asked another set of people, how important is it to be able to express who you are? And on this question, 82% said it was important, a jump of almost 20 points. This 20-point jump, when we reframe in terms of opportunities to express yourself, is very interesting. And it seems to connect to the values of health and well-being, which we're going to explore more in our focus groups. I mentioned a few moments ago that most people embrace arts and culture explicitly in the context of their kids. In fact, the strongest message of all the messages we tested in our national survey was this: every child deserves a well-rounded education that teaches them not just to read and write, but to think creatively and solve problems, to work together and to express their unique talent and ideas. And one of the best ways to learn these skills is to experience arts and culture in the classroom. 81% of people said that was an effective message in motivating them to want to put more arts and culture in their own lives and to do more of the creative things they enjoy. 40% of men found that message to be very effective, and 59% of women. It was by far the strongest message we tested, and it alone occupies the top tier of successful messaging. The next tier is occupied by two messages that we tested that were very close to each other in terms of effectiveness. One connected to the arts and the meaning they allow us to find in our lives, and the second related to how the arts and culture allow us to reconnect with ourselves, reduce our stress, and contribute to our overall health and well-being. Since our effort is focused nationally on building public will for the arts broadly as a part of our everyday lives, I don't think we're going to gravitate towards the well-rounded education message as our lead message. But what we learn about the arts education message will certainly be among the findings that we share next year. And I hope you'll all feel free to take what we learn and make use of it in any way that helps advance your work. In the meantime, here are some suggestions for what you might want to consider doing when you go back to your own communities next week. First, beware the perils associated with being a true believer. I know you believe very deeply in what you do. You wouldn't do it if you didn't. The problem we encounter is when we assume that everyone else out there has that same values, those same commitment, the same worldview. The fact is, everyone else doesn't share our values, our commitment, our worldview. So what do we do with that? Do we recognize that everyone doesn't need to believe the same things in order to find common ground? Or do we hold to the moral high ground and insist that everyone play by our rules? I'm not saying that you should sell your soul and come over to the dark side. I am saying that we need to recognize that people can come from very different places and take a very different route and still arrive at the very same destination. I think we also need to stop spending so much time and energy preaching to the choir. This is a tough one because we definitely need to work our base. We need them to be on our side, and we need them to stand up when it's needed and demand certain things. But just because we can stir up the folks who already agree with us doesn't mean we can rile up anyone else. The same arguments that might generate hallelujahs from the faithful are not necessarily the same arguments that will work with other folks. And if we're not careful, we might end up with campaigns like this one that actually have the potential to do harm. If you can't read that, the copy there says, kids will express themselves with or without the arts. So we need to get out of our own way. We can't design arguments to rile ourselves up. In fact, we need to remember that it's not about us at all. What works for us, what motivates us, what gets us up all in arms and ready to go to battle, will probably only work with people who think and feel exactly like us. And how many of them can there really be? Not enough. I think we should also reconsider our champions. Think about the people we put out there most often as spokespersons and champions for lifelong arts learning. School principals, arts teachers like this one on The Simpsons, involved parents, working artists. I mean, come on. Frankly, when people hear arts educators or school principals talk about the importance of art education, they're really not very surprised. What kind of arts educator would not support arts education, right? Let's hear from some unusual suspects: public policy leaders, community and business leaders, psychologists, public health leaders. I think that's an important message and one of the themes of this conference that I know you're talking about: forming new partnerships and collaborations that extend your reach and influence, adopting more of a collective impact approach. I think that's part of something we all need to do. We also need to settle in for the long haul. Public will isn't built in a year. It takes time, it takes patience, it takes a clear, consistent strategy sustained over the long term, and it takes money. There are two, unfortunately, contradictory implications of settling in for the long haul. The good news is that what history tells us is that American society is consistently evolving in a progressive direction. Sure, there are setbacks along the way and entire generations where we seem to be falling back to what might be perceived by some to be the safe harbor of conservatism, but over time we're moving in a progressive direction. The bad news is that too many children are losing opportunities to participate in the arts every year. That's particularly true of children in underserved communities, as you all know. We're moving toward a time when the only kids exposed to arts on any meaningful level will be those kids whose parents care and can afford it. In many respects, that day is already here. And what does that mean for the future of arts education if the next generation of voters and decision makers has no idea what real arts education is all about? If they don't know it when they see it, and they really don't know they missed it, and they don't know what it looks like, how will they know what to demand? And it will only get worse unless we do something about it. I'm confident that we can and we will, but we have to be bold. We have to stop allowing ourselves to believe that the institutions we've built, both literal and figurative, are the center of our world and the dominant image the public associates with us and our work. This field of dream fantasy where we think, if we build it, they will come. This strategy will work with some people some of the time. There's no question that there's a core of arts enthusiasts and activists for whom that kind of strategy will always be effective, but they're not the majority. Not even close, at least not yet. Our hope is that this group will grow over time to eventually become the majority, but that's going to take time. And we won't win over people by taking for granted that they already appreciate the art for its own sake and just need to be encouraged to demand more of it. This art-centric, well, of course you must want it, who wouldn't, framing is painfully close to patronizing and not in a good way. To reach and effectively engage the rest of folks, we need to find and meet them where they are. Instead of trying to entice them to want what we have to offer, we need to offer them something they value, something they might not even know they need. We need to understand what they're doing and what they value in their own lives, and then show them how much more of that stuff exists out there in the world. in their schools, in their communities, then we have to give them the motivation to seek it out for themselves. In effect, we need to help them make the leap. I'm glad you like that. We're hoping and intending that the research we're doing here in California and across the country will provide advocates like you with new understanding to help people of all ages to take the leap, to embrace lifelong arts learning, and to make the arts and culture, whether they call it that or not, a recognized, valued, and expected part of their everyday lives. Thank you very much.